When we talk about Operation Lion's Roar, it's easy to focus on the mechanics, the targets, the weapons, the timing, but that misses the deeper point, because at its core, this operation was not just about destruction or disruption. It was about something far more strategic, redefining the balance of power before it could be defined by someone else. This is a moment where the United States and Israel made a calculation that goes beyond immediate conflict. They weren't just responding to a threat. They were attempting to shape the future environment in which that threat exists. And that distinction is critical, because in geopolitics, there is a big difference between reacting to events and trying to control the conditions that produce those events. From a strategic perspective, this operation is what we call a preemptive move, not in the sense of eliminating an immediate attack, but in the sense of preventing a future one from becoming unavoidable. The logic is simple but powerful. If you wait until the threat fully materializes, your options shrink dramatically. If you act earlier, you may still have the ability to influence the outcome. But here's the psychological layer that makes this so important. Preemption is not just a military doctrine. It's reflects a belief that the world is entering a phase where waiting is riskier than acting, that the cost of inaction may outweigh the cost of escalation. And that belief fundamentally changes how decisions are made. So when decision makers look at Iran in this context, they're not just looking at what Iran is doing today. They're asking a much more difficult question. What will Iran be capable of tomorrow? And more importantly, will that future capability alter the balance of power in a way that is no longer manageable? This is where strategy becomes deeply forward-looking. It's not about responding to the present. It's about anticipating the future and intervening before that future becomes locked in. Now, Operation Lion's Roar can be understood as an attempt to intervene in exactly that way, to disrupt not just current capabilities, but future trajectories, to slow momentum, to introduce uncertainty into a system that from the perspective of its planners was becoming increasingly predictable in its direction. Because once a state begins to approach a certain level of capability, whether nuclear, military, or technological, it changes how other actors behave. It alters deterrence relationships, it shifts regional calculations, and it forces other powers to respond, sometimes in ways that escalate tension rather than reduce it. So the objective here is not simply to strike targets, it is to shape behavior. And that brings us to an important philosophical point. In modern conflict, power is not just about force, it's about perception. If you can influence how your adversary perceives risk, you can influence their decisions. If you can introduce uncertainty into their planning, you can slow their progress. And if you can demonstrate that certain paths carry unacceptable consequences, you can redirect their behavior without having to engage in continuous conflict. That is the theory behind operations like this. But of course, theory and reality are not always aligned, because when you take action at this level, you are also sending a signal, not just to your adversary, but to the entire international system. You are demonstrating that certain thresholds have been crossed, that certain risks are now considered acceptable, and that you are willing to act to enforce your strategic interests. And that signal has consequences. For allies, it reinforces confidence. It shows commitment. It demonstrates that commitments are not just words, but actions. For adversaries, it raises questions. How far are your opponents willing to go? What are their limits? How will they respond if pushed further? And that uncertainty in itself becomes part of the strategy. Because in a system like this, ambiguity can be a tool. If your adversary does not fully understand your thresholds, your intentions, or your red lines, they must operate more cautiously. And that caution can slow down their decision-making, constrain their options, and increase the cost of their actions. So in a very real sense, Operation Lion's Roar was not just about physical targets. It was about psychological positioning. It was about signaling that the balance of power is not fixed, that it can be challenged, that it can be reshaped, and that certain trajectories will not be allowed to continue unchecked. But here's the paradox that always exists in these situations. When you try to prevent a future threat, you also take on a present risk. Because every action creates a reaction. Every strike creates the possibility of retaliation. Every escalation narrows the space for de-escalation. And yet, doing nothing is not always a neutral choice. Sometimes inaction is interpreted as weakness. as hesitation, as an opening. So leaders are constantly navigating between two risks, the risk of acting too soon and the risk of acting too late. And in that space between those two risks, decisions are made. Operation Lion's Roar sits precisely in that space. It represents a moment where leaders decided that the future risk had become too significant to ignore, that the trajectory needed to be altered, that the balance of power required intervention, not in response to a crisis already fully realized, but in anticipation of one that was still forming. And that is what makes this operation so significant, because it tells us something fundamental about how the world is changing. We are entering an era where power is no longer just about reacting to threats. It is about shaping the conditions under which those threats emerge. And the question is no longer just what you do when a crisis happens. The question is whether you can influence the trajectory before the crisis becomes inevitable. And if there's one thing worth reflecting on, it's this. In a world defined by uncertainty, the most powerful actors are not the ones who respond best to change, but the ones who are able to shape it before it forces their hand. If key point one is about strategy and shaping the future, then key point two is about something just as powerful, but far more immediate, perception under pressure. Because when we look at Operation Lion's Roar, we're not just looking at what leaders knew, we're looking at what they believed they knew, and how that belief drove action. The role of intelligence in modern conflict is often misunderstood. People tend to think of intelligence as a precise, almost scientific input into decision-making, but in reality, intelligence is interpretive. It's built from incomplete information, filtered through assumptions, and analyzed under time pressure. And when the stakes are high enough, even small uncertainties can have outsized consequences. In the case of the United States and Israel, the perception was that Iran had crossed or was approaching a critical threshold. Whether that threshold was nuclear, military, or technological, the key point is this: it was seen as imminent enough to demand action. Now, this is where psychology becomes as important as strategy, because in high-stakes environments, decision makers are not just evaluating facts. They are evaluating risk under uncertainty. And in that environment, two different leaders can look at the same data and arrive at two very different conclusions. One might say, we still have time. The other might say, time is running out. And that difference is not just analytical, it's existential. Because if you believe a threat is approaching a point of no return, then delay becomes the greater risk. But if you believe the threat is still manageable, then action can seem premature, even dangerous. This tension is at the heart of almost every major preemptive decision in modern history. So what changes the equation? Often it's not a single piece of information. It's a pattern, a trajectory, a sense that things are moving in a direction that, if left unchecked, will become irreversible. And once that belief takes hold, it begins to shape everything. Leaders start to frame the situation differently. Intelligence is interpreted through a lens of urgency. Military options are weighed not just against present conditions, but against future possibilities. And the question becomes less about what is happening right now and more about what will happen if we do nothing. That shift is subtle, but it is decisive, because once inaction is perceived as riskier than action, the threshold for using force changes dramatically. Now, this is where we have to acknowledge something important. Intelligence is not neutral. It is always embedded within political, institutional, and psychological contexts. Analysts may strive for objectivity, but decision makers operate in a world where timing, pressure, and success and consequence all matter. And that means intelligence is rarely just about what is true. It's about what is believed to be true at the moment of decision. And that moment is often irreversible. So when we talk about Operation Lion's Roar, we're talking about a point where perception and urgency aligned, where the interpretation of intelligence suggested that waiting carried unacceptable risk, and where leaders concluded that the window for effective action was either closing or had already begun to close. This is where we see one of the central paradoxes of modern security. The more capable a potential adversary becomes, the more urgent it feels to act. But the more you act, the more you risk triggering the very escalation you're trying to prevent. So you are constantly balancing between two futures, one where you act too early and create unnecessary conflict, and one where you act too late and lose control of the outcome entirely. And in that balance, perception becomes everything, because you are not just reacting to what your adversary is, you are reacting to what you believe they are becoming. That's a crucial distinction. In this case, the concern around Iran was not just about current capabilities. It was about trajectory, about momentum, about whether the systems in place were moving toward a point where deterrence would no longer be sufficient. And if that belief becomes strong enough, it changes the logic of action, because at that point, the goal is no longer just deterrence, it becomes disruption. To slow down progress, to introduce uncertainty, to delay timelines, to force recalculation. And that is what intelligence ultimately enables, not just understanding the present, but shaping how the future is anticipated. But here's the deeper psychological layer we often overlook. In moments like this, leaders are not just managing external threats, they are managing internal pressure, pressure from advisors, pressure from political systems, pressure from public expectations, pressure from history itself. Because no leader wants to be the one who waited too long. That fear is powerful. It shapes decisions in ways that are rarely visible to the public, but deeply influential behind closed doors. And so when intelligence suggests or for us seeds that a threshold may be approaching, that fear can tip the balance, not because the data is perfect, but because the consequences of inaction are perceived as catastrophic. This is the world we are operating in now. A world where intelligence is imperfect, where timelines are uncertain, and where decisions must be made under conditions of ambiguity. And in that world, perception is not just important, it is decisive, because it determines when leaders act, how they act, and how far they are willing to go. So when we look at Operation Lion's Roar, we should not just ask whether the intelligence was accurate. We should ask a more important question. What happens in a system where the perception of threat is enough to trigger action? Because if perception drives action, then stability depends not just on reality, but on how reality is interpreted. And that is a far more fragile foundation. So the lesson here is not just about this operation. It's about the broader system we are all part of, a system where decisions are made under pressure, with incomplete information, and with consequences that can ripple far beyond their original intent. And the most important thing we can understand is this. In a world like this, it is not always the most powerful information that drives action, but the most urgent perception. And once urgency takes hold, everything else begins to follow. The question is whether we recognize that in time, or only after the consequences have already unfolded. If strategy defines intent and intelligence shapes urgency, then coordination defines credibility, because Operation Lion's Roar wasn't just about what the United States did or what Israel did independently. It was about what they did together and what that togetherness signaled to everyone watching. In international politics, unity is never accidental. It is constructed, negotiated, often fragile. And when it appears in the form of joint military action, it carries a message far beyond the immediate tactical objective. At a surface level, this kind of coordination sends a clear signal to an adversary like Iran. You are not dealing with a single actor, you are dealing with a coalition. And that matters because it changes the scale of the problem. Scale of a single state can be tested, its red lines can be probed, its resolve can be challenged. But when two aligned powers act together, the calculation becomes more complex. Now, the question is not just how will one country respond, but how will multiple actors respond in sync? That's a fundamentally different level of risk. But beneath that strategic layer, there is something more psychological at work, because coordination is also about trust. And trust in geopolitics is one of the most valuable and most difficult assets to build. When countries coordinate at this level, they are making a statement not just to their adversary, but to each other. They are signaling alignment of priorities, alignment of threat perception, and alignment of long-term objectives. And that alignment matters because in moments of crisis, misalignment is often more dangerous than the crisis itself. We've seen this throughout history, alliances that fracture under pressure, partnerships that weaken when interests diverge, coalitions that struggle to act decisively because they are not fully synchronized. Operation Lion's Roar, by contrast, reflects the opposite: synchronization, a shared understanding of risk, a shared willingness to act, and a shared belief that the moment required not just consultation, but execution. That kind of alignment doesn't happen overnight. It's the result of sustained diplomatic engagement, intelligence sharing, and a long history of cooperation. But when it culminates in action, it sends a very powerful message to the world. It tells other states, this is a relationship that works. This is a partnership that can convert strategy into action, and this is a coalition that can enforce its interests. Now, why does that matter so much? Because in the current international system, power is not just about individual strength. It's about network strength. It's about who you can rely on, who will act with you, and how quickly that action can be coordinated when it matters most. And in that sense, joint military operations are not just tactical, they are reputational, they demonstrate capability, but more importantly, they demonstrate reliability. And reliability is what gives alliances their real power. For the United States and Israel, this kind of coordination reinforces a long-standing strategic relationship. It signals continuity, it reassures domestic audiences, and it communicates to allies that commitments are not abstract. They are operational, but for observers, especially in other regions, the signal is equally important because it raises a question. If two closely aligned powers can coordinate this effectively, what does that mean for the rest of the system? It introduces a level of predictability into an otherwise unpredictable environment. And in international relations, predictability can be stabilizing, but it can also be intimidating because it reduces ambiguity. And when ambiguity decreases, clarity increases. And clarity often sharpens strategic competition. Now, there's another layer to this: deterrence. Joint operations are a form of signaling. They are designed to communicate capability, resolve, and coordination. And in doing so, they contribute to deterrence, not just by showing what you can do, but by showing that you can act decisively and in unison. For Iran, this changes the calculus because it's no longer just about assessing the capabilities of a single adversary. It's about assessing the combined capabilities of multiple actors and how they might respond under different scenarios. That raises the cost of miscalculation. It increases the number of variables that need to be considered, and it complicates decision-making at every level. But deterrence is not static. It evolves with each action. And that's where things become more delicate because every demonstration of coordination also carries the risk of escalation. Every show of unity can be interpreted as preparation. Every joint action can be seen as a step towards something larger. So while coordination strengthens deterrence, it also tightens the feedback loop between action and reaction, and that feedback loop is where risk accumulates. But perhaps the most important aspect of coordination is what it reveals about leadership, because coordination at this level requires a willingness to align not just military objectives, but political ones as well. It requires shared risk tolerance, shared strategic framing, and a shared understanding of what is and is not acceptable. That kind of alignment is difficult to achieve and even harder to maintain. But when it exists, it allows for something powerful, the ability to act with coherence in a chaotic environment. And coherence in moments of uncertainty is a form of strength. So when we look at Operation Lion's Roar, we should not just see a military operation. We should see a demonstration of coordination as strategy, a demonstration that power today is not just about what you control individually, but about what you can coordinate collectively. And that is a shift that has profound implications. Because in a world where alliances are tested, where threats are evolving, and where decisions must be made under pressure, the ability to act in alignment may be the difference between stability and escalation. So the question is not just who has power. The question is who can align it. And in the end, it is that alignment more than anything else that determines how far power can go and how far it is willing to. If coordination tells us about alignment, then controlled escalation tells us about restraint, and in many ways about control over chaos itself, because Operation Lion's Roar wasn't designed to unleash maximum force. It was designed to calibrate force, to apply enough pressure to send a message, but not so much that it triggers an uncontrollable chain reaction. And that distinction is absolutely critical. In the context of this operation, the United States and Israel were not simply asking, can we act? They were asking, How far can we act without losing control of what happens next? And that's the essence of controlled escalation. It's not about avoiding conflict. It's about managing it, shaping it, keeping it within boundaries that serve strategic objectives rather than allowing it to spiral into something far more destructive. Now, why is that so important? Because in modern conflict, the greatest risk is not just the initial strike. It's the response to the response. Once you take action against a state like Iran, you are entering a dynamic system. And in that system, every move creates pressure. Every pressure creates a potential reaction. And every reaction can shift the entire trajectory of the conflict. So the challenge becomes, how do you signal strength without inviting overreaction? How do you demonstrate capability without forcing your adversary into a corner where their only viable option is escalation? That's where the psychology of signaling becomes central. In a controlled escalation strategy, each action is designed to communicate something very specific. It says, we are capable, we are willing, but we are also measured. That balance is incredibly difficult to maintain because strength, if misread, can look like aggression, and restraint, if misinterpreted, can look like weakness. So decision makers are constantly navigating between two risks, being too forceful or not forceful enough. And in that narrow space, strategy becomes almost surgical. Every target is selected not just for its operational value, but for its symbolic meaning. Every strike is timed not just for effectiveness, but for its message. And every action is weighed against its potential to provoke a broader response. Because the ultimate goal is not destruction, it is influence. Now, this kind of strategy relies heavily on one key assumption, that escalation can be controlled, that it can be guided, that it can be contained. But that assumption is always under pressure because escalation by its nature is unpredictable. Once conflict begins, it develops its own momentum, and that momentum can sometimes move faster than the intentions of the people who initiated it. This is where the risk of miscalculation becomes very real. An action intended as limited can be perceived as expansive. A message intended as a warning can be interpreted as a declaration, and a response intended to deter can instead provoke. And once that happens, the situation can shift very quickly. So the real question is not just, whether escalation can be controlled, but how long it can be controlled, because there is always a threshold, a point at which limited action transitions into broader conflict. And identifying that threshold is one of the most difficult challenges in international security. In the case of Operation Lion's Roar, the intent appears to have been to stay well below that threshold, to send a message of capability and resolve without triggering a full-scale regional conflict. But even when that intent is clear, the outcome is never guaranteed, because in a system with multiple actors, each with their own perceptions, interests, and thresholds, control is never absolute. It is negotiated. And that negotiation happens in real time, often under pressure and always with incomplete information. Now, let's take a step back and look at what this tells us about the nature of modern warfare. We are no longer in an era where wars are simply about winning or losing in a traditional sense. We are in an era where wars are often about signaling, positioning, and managing escalation, where the objective is not total victory, but strategic advantage, where restraint can be as important as force, and where the ability to stop is just as important as the ability to start. This is a much more complex environment because it requires not only military capability, but political discipline, not only strength, but judgment, and not only resolve, but restraint. And those qualities are not always aligned. In fact, they are often in tension, because the same instincts that drive leaders to act, decisiveness, confidence, assertiveness, can also make it difficult to stop once action has begun. And that is where the greatest risk lies, not in the decision to escalate, but in the difficulty of managing what comes after. So controlled escalation is not just a tactic, it's a test of whether leaders can maintain control in a situation designed to challenge it, a test of whether signals can be sent without being misinterpreted, and a test of whether conflict can be shaped without being allowed to spiral beyond intention. And in that sense, Operation Lion's Roar is as much about restraint as it is about force. It reflects an effort to navigate one of the most difficult challenges in geopolitics, how to act decisively without losing control of the outcome. But here's the deeper question that this raises for all of us. If escalation can be controlled, then control itself becomes the most valuable resource in conflict. And if control is the goal, then the real measure of success is not how much force you can use, but how precisely you can use it. Because in a world where escalation can no longer be fully predicted, the ability to manage it, to guide it, to contain it, and if necessary, to stop it, may be the difference between a limited conflict and a far larger one. So the real lesson here is not about escalation alone. It's about control. And the question we should all be asking is this: in a world where the stakes are rising, do we still have the capacity to control what we set in motion? Or are we beginning to enter a phase where control itself becomes the most fragile element of all?